Uma boa tarde a todos e todas. O meu nome é Italo Lins e eu sou professor do curso de Filosofia da Universidade Federal do Cariri, UFCA. Eu gostaria de dar as boas-vindas à 31ª edição do Ciclo de Palestras da Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia Analítica, SBFA. O Ciclo de Palestras da SBFA é uma atividade mensal na qual integrantes da comunidade convidam pesquisadores e pesquisadoras para apresentarem seus trabalhos mais recentes. Os eventos são transmitidos ao vivo pelo YouTube da SBFA e o ciclo tem o objetivo de reunir a nossa comunidade em torno das discussões nas mais variadas áreas da filosofia analítica. Para quem estiver acompanhando esta conferência ao vivo, hoje, que é sexta-feira, dia 25 de julho de 2025, fique à vontade para fazer perguntas em português ou em inglês pelo chat do YouTube, pois, havendo tempo ao final da exposição, e haverá, poderemos realizar a sua pergunta para a nossa convidada. Hoje, teremos a honra de contar com a participação da professora Amie Thomasson, de Dartmouth College, que apresentará a conferência intitulada Rethinking Metaphysics as Conceptual Engineering. Agora passarei a falar em inglês, pois é nesta língua que a conferência será ministrada. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Italo Lins, and I am a professor of philosophy at Universidade Federal do Cariri, UFCA, in Brazil. I would like to welcome you to the 31st edition of the Brazilian Society for Analytical Philosophy, SBFA, conference cycle. The SBFA conference cycle is a monthly event in which members of our community invite researchers to present their latest work. The events are broadcast live on the SBFA YouTube channel, and the series aims to bring our community together for discussions about a wide range of fields in analytical philosophy. For those watching this conference live, today is Friday, July 25th, 2025, feel free to ask questions in Portuguese or English via the YouTube chat. If time permits, and it will, at the end of the presentation, we may ask your question to our guest. Today, we are honored to have Professor Amie Thomasson from Dartmouth College, and I'm going to read a small biography in this book. So, Amie Thomasson is the Daniel P. Stone Professor of Intellectual and Moral Philosophy at Dartmouth College. She is the author of 4 prior books: Norms and Necessity from 2020, Ontology Made Easy from 2015, which is this book over here, which was the winner of the Sanders Book Prize, Ordinary Objects from 2007, which is this book over here, and also Fiction and Metaphysics from 1999. And she is also the co-editor of Phenomenology and Philosophy of Mind from 2005. She has published more than 80 papers on topics in metaphysics, philosophical methodology and metametaphysics, philosophy of art, social ontology, philosophy of mind, and phenomenology. She has been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship and has twice held fellowships with the National Endowment for the Humanities. Today, she's going to deliver the conference Rethinking Metaphysics as Conceptual Engineering, which is about this book. This is her latest book, published this year, 2025, by the Oxford University Press. So, Professor Thomasson, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's an honor to have you here with us.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and especially for inviting me to speak in this forum. So I thought what I would do is to give a kind of short overview of the main topics and line of argument in my most recent book, Rethinking Metaphysics, that came out in April. I apologize. It seems like some of the pictures in my slides didn't come up, but I think all the text is there, so we will be okay. There we go. Okay, so I thought I'd first try to clarify how this work fits in with my prior work, though I won't presuppose any familiarity with my prior work in this talk. So the big project that I've really been working on over the last 10 to 15 years, I think of as the project of trying to both demystify metaphysics and trying to redirect it to sort of clearer and more tractable pursuits. The way I think about it, metaphysics has largely, though not entirely, consisted of two types of projects or questions. One of them has been ontological debates, that is, debates about what exists, right? Do tables and chairs exist? This was a question I addressed in Ordinary Objects. Do numbers, properties, possible worlds, etc., exist? These kinds of ontological debates about what exists, I address in Ontology Made Easy in 2015, trying to show how these kinds of questions can be addressed using nothing more mysterious than a kind of combination of conceptual work and often, at least, empirical information. The other sort of big topic for metaphysics concerns what you can roughly think of as modal debates. That is, that includes debates about identity conditions of things of various sorts, persons, ships, whatever, persistence conditions, about the natures or essences of things of various kinds, and so on. And there's, I think, a widespread feeling that even if you can answer existence questions easily, that all these kinds of modal debates remain. So I address those in my 2020 book, Norms and Necessity, again, trying to argue for how these kinds of modal questions can be answered clearly using nothing more mysterious than a combination of conceptual and empirical work. If anyone wants to talk about how those go in each case, I'm happy to discuss that in the Q&A too. At any rate, I think of this book, Rethinking Metaphysics, as the sort of third of a kind of trilogy here, where what I am addressing here is the constructive question. Look, if traditional debates about existence and modality can be answered straightforwardly, what else remains, or what remains for metaphysics to do? And that's the question I address in Rethinking Metaphysics. So it's sort of the constructive part of the project. Rethinking Metaphysics, there should have been a picture of it there. I divide into two parts. Part one is the sort of critical part, saying why we need to rethink metaphysics and why many of the traditional and recent ways of thinking about the work of metaphysics are problematic. That's the motivation. Part two is the constructive part, trying to show how we should rethink metaphysics, thinking of it instead as a kind of project in conceptual engineering, which I'll say more about. Okay, so sorry, the spacing's gone funny too. In part one, as I mentioned, I try to motivate the need to rethink metaphysics by showing problems with 5 prior conceptions. One is sort of the general traditional conception. The 2 is the explanatory conception that's usually traced to Quine. 3 is the structural conception that's been defended by like Ted Sider recently. 4 is the truth-maker conception. And 5 involves rethinking metaphysics as involved in fundamentality or grounding projects. So let me just say a little bit briefly about those. I'll focus my talk today on the part 2, the positive project, because to me, that's what's most interesting. But let me try to give you a little bit of an overview of the sort of critical part too. So the traditional conception of metaphysics, as I treat it, really thinks of metaphysics roughly as the study of ultimate reality, right? And when I started this book, I actually went back to all of the basic metaphysics textbooks and anthologies that are on my shelf to teach from. And they all start from something like this conception, the study of ultimate reality, or of the world and what it's like, or of what's fundamental. Now, if you think of metaphysics in these traditional terms, there are also some really very familiar problems, right? One is the rivalry with the sciences. That is, metaphysics as we think of it, of course, is a tradition that goes way back to at least Plato and Aristotle, right? Way before the development of the modern natural sciences. But nowadays, if you think of metaphysics as investigating ultimate reality and what it's like, a natural question arises, like, isn't that what the natural sciences do? And maybe even do better with a clearer epistemology, with better, more agreed upon results that have also enabled great technological developments, right? So if you think of metaphysics as engaged in discovering what reality is like, you have to face that question. Isn't that what physics does? And maybe does better. And it's with this problem in mind that, like, as some of you might remember, Stephen Hawking back in, I think it was about 2010, said philosophy is dead because all the basic questions about reality and what it's like have been taken over by physics. So that's one big type of problem. A second type of problem is the proliferation of metaphysical views, right? In the sciences, again, apart from in the sort of most controversial and theoretical ends that start to overlap with metaphysics, there tends to be a sort of gradual convergence of views that gives us greater confidence that we're on the right track. Whereas metaphysical views seem to only proliferate. We get, in my lifetime, the views about what exists have gotten ever more diverse and spread out, without even a clear agreement on what it would take to resolve the differences. Whereas, again, in the natural sciences, even where differences remain, sorry, there we go. There tends to be agreement about what kind of experiment will be needed to tell which is the correct view. And this kind of proliferation of metaphysical views also leads to a kind of skepticism that we could ever really know the real truth about what really exists or is most fundamental, or which metaphysical view of ordinary objects is correct, and so on. This is tied up with what I call the epistemological mystery of traditional metaphysics. That is, how could we come to know which among the competing metaphysical views is the true or correct one? And again, there tends to be no clear agreement on even what the right strategy is, or where they agree on sort of very general approaches, like we want to look for the view with the most theoretic virtues, right? It's also pretty clear that there's no unique answer given by this, and there's debate about whether the theoretic virtues actually give us reason for thinking that the relevant metaphysical claims are true. All right, so those are all sort of familiar problems with the most traditional way of thinking about metaphysics. There have also been various more specific ways of thinking of metaphysics that have taken off in the last, say, 50 years. So I'll just talk about 4 of those briefly. One is what I call the explanatory conception, that's usually traced to Quine and his influence, though I think it often involves a kind of misinterpretation of what the historical Quine was up to, but I'll put that to the side. Anyway, on this conception, metaphysics aims to answer the question, what is there? Or at least ontology does, by seeing what entities we must quantify over in our best explanatory theories. Right? This was really what was dominant in the 90s, right, when I was in graduate school. Now, the underlying problem with this kind of conception that I identify, there's obviously a lot more detail in the book, is that it assumes that the function of all the nouns, at least those we care about in metaphysics, whether they're nouns for tables or electrons or moral obligations or possible worlds or the number 7, it assumes that they all ought to or are supposed to refer to entities that serve as explainers in our best explanatory theories. But in chapter 2 of the book, I try to argue that even within a scientific theory, different terms, for example, terms for numbers, noun terms for numbers like the number 7 or something like that, and terms for properties, such as the term like the property of being negatively charged, can play really different roles in our theories from terms for explainers, like a term such as electron or Pluto or black hole. There's good reason for thinking that what these terms do is not try to refer to some posited entity that's going to explain our observations, but enable us to even formulate generalized questions and theories, to systematize data, and so on. I'll come back to that later when we get to the work on linguistic functions. Secondly, The idea that we should only accept entities if we have to quantify over them in our best explanatory theories overlooks the fact that while scientific theories are awesome, we do many things in life other than trying to formulate explanatory theories. Consider the functions of our, say, moral discourse or legal discourse, right? In those kinds of contexts, it's not obvious that we're trying to explain anything at all, rather than trying to do something like regulate behavior or set up a bureaucracy and so on. And if that's the case, it's not at all clear why we should think there's some problem with these terms if they're not referring to entities that will serve in our best scientific theories. So the sort of biggest fundamental point underlying my criticisms of this explanatory conception is that the criterion that says only accept that entities of a certain kind exist if the relevant terms must quantify over them in our best explanatory theories just overlooks the fact that our different kinds of terms can play many different roles. And if we don't assume that they all should refer to explainers, then there's no justification for introducing something like a contribution of explanatory power criterion for accepting objects of different kinds, possible worlds, moral properties, numbers, whatever. The structural conception of metaphysics was introduced later by Ted Sider, who argues that metaphysics aims to discover the fundamental structure of the world, or to determine which terms carve the world at its joints. And he thinks we can apply this to any kinds of terms whatsoever. This question: do logical terms carve the world at its joints? Do modal terms? Do moral terms? And so on. And in doing so, again, he makes what I call a functional monist assumption. That is, he assumes that there's a problem if there's terms that aren't aiming to carve the world at its joints, and that these aren't describing then sort of how the world really is. So he assumes that all of the terms of interest in metaphysics should function to carve the world at its joints or to track structure. And again, this ignores the possibility that, say, our modal terms or moral terms just have really different functions than even trying to carve the world at its joints or to track worldly structure. So again, we have a kind of problematic functional monist assumption. Another conception of metaphysics that's been really popular over the last 30, 40 years is a kind of truth maker conception, defended by, I think, David Armstrong probably did the most to make it famous. Obviously, there's elements of it in Wittgenstein's Tractatus, and recent thinkers like Ross Cameron and John Heil, Heather Dyke, others have defended a version of this. In its strong version, the way this is thought of is that the task of metaphysics is not to figure out what we must quantify over in our best scientific theories, but rather to figure out what has to exist to make those claims that we think are true, to make them true. What are the truth makers? Again, there's a number of problems I raise for this view, but a sort of underlying one is, look, there's many ways to describe the truth makers for any true claim, because language is, as you might call it, ontologically flexible. That is to say, suppose you have a simple statement like, the apple is red, right? What are the truth makers for this? Well, you might want to say it's the fact or state of affairs of the apples being red. You might want to say it's the object instantiating a certain Platonistic property of being red. You might want to say it's the object, the apple, having a redness trope, right? And so on, for many, many alternatives. Which of these describes the real truth makers? It's totally unclear how you could ever figure that out. So this kind of view also suffers from a kind of epistemological mystery. There's a weaker version of the truth maker view of metaphysics that says, look, for any claim we accept as true, we have to at least accept some truth makers. And if you don't, you get accused of cheating. This is in Armstrong and in Sider. They all do this sort of preventing cheating strategy. So we don't have to decide which they are, but if you're going to accept dispositional claims or modal claims or moral claims, you have to at least accept some truth makers. But again, this truth maker view leaves out a range of familiar options, like expressivist views of moral discourse, for example, without any argument. So these views that would say they don't need truth makers, and leaves us with a range of familiar problems. Where could we find the truth makers for our moral discourse, for example? How would they fit into the world? How could we be causally related to them? Most importantly, even this weak version of the truth maker approach assumes a form of functional monism about language, namely that all discourse aims or should aim to track or describe the world so that it makes sense to ask, what are those worldly features that make it true? More recently, there's been a range of these fundamentality and grounding projects in metaphysics, of which I think the most widespread version is Jonathan Schaffer's view that the project of metaphysics is to determine what grounds what. I'm a little bit gentler on this conception than the prior ones. That is, I agree that at least in some cases, it can be interesting to address local grounding questions about what grounds social objects or something like that. But I think there are also some serious limitations and problems. One is, I think we desperately need to clarify the epistemology of grounding. How can we find out the answers to grounding questions and resolve debates about them? There's very little discussion or agreement about that. I think one way out for this is to see grounding relations as being reflections of a variety of different linguistic and conceptual rules. And I try to sketch that in this chapter 5 of the book. Though it won't include everything grounding theorists want out of grounding relations, it will make them conceptually tractable and so non-mysterious in the way that I aim to. But we also have a functional monist problem here too, right? The grounding picture encourages us to think of the world as like a layer cake, right? Where we have higher level entities grounded in lower level entities, and we have to sort of ask about what grounds the various entities. But it's not clear that our terms for moral obligations, possible worlds, numbers, etc., aim to refer to something that's part of this leveled structure of reality. So it may again be the wrong question, what grounds numbers or what grounds our moral obligations? The view that this is always a good question, again, presupposes a kind of functional monist view that assumes all these terms function to track some features of reality. So we only have to ask where they fit in the sort of grounded layers of reality. So the underlying problem, I think, for all of these ways of thinking about metaphysics is something I call the metaphysical malady. And that's this, right? Metaphysics traditionally addresses all sorts of topics of discourse. And those who try to distinguish metaphysics from science often say, yeah, this is the difference. It's much broader, right? We're interested not just in the physical world, but also in numbers, moral properties, modal properties, freedom, time, mind, whatever, right? So metaphysics is supposed to be completely general. But at the same time, these kinds of approaches to metaphysics assume a sort of functional monism about all these different sorts of language. The usual form is assuming that all these forms of discourse, whether we're talking about tables, numbers, moral obligations, whatever, aim to represent or track or describe features of the world, or sometimes that they aim to refer to entities that will explain things. So that all we have to do is ask, what are these things? What are their natures? And then we're away with metaphysics. Against this, I want to suggest that we at least entertain the option that different parts of the language system can serve different functions. Sorry, that slide was cut off. So before we engage in metaphysical questions like, do moral obligations exist? What kinds of things are they? And so on. Ask first about the functions of the relevant form of discourse. and by what rules this discourse is introduced and what rules it follows that enable it to fulfill those functions. Because only then, I think, can we really determine what criteria of evaluation are suitable, like you've got to have truth makers or you've got to contribute explanatory power. What questions are appropriate, like how could we locate these things in the natural world and how we can answer them. So that's the lesson of part one, right? That all these conceptions of metaphysics have a kind of hidden presupposition that all of the language of interest in metaphysics has the same function to describe or track the world, or sometimes to explain things about it. And that before we dive into metaphysical questions, we need to start back and ask these kind of functional questions about language. Once we, or if we acknowledge the potential for functional pluralism in language, we shouldn't demand that all our noun terms have to refer to entities that add explanatory power to our theories, or require that all of them be evaluated in terms of how well they carve at the joints or track structure, or insist that we have to find some portion of reality to serve as a truth maker for any claims we accept, or always demand a metaphysical explanation of what our non-fundamental entities are grounded in. Okay, so part two then gives us constructive work of how we should rethink metaphysics. And the short form of the answer is I argue for rethinking of metaphysics as not a deep investigation into the world and what it's like, but as conceptual engineering, where I understand this quite broadly, as including both a kind of reverse engineering that asks about what functions the term or concept serves and how well it serves them, what rules it follows. That's kind of descriptive work, and constructive and evaluative engineering, asking if these functions are ones we should continue to serve, that are still served well or were ever served well, and if we need to make any changes in our conceptual or linguistic scheme. In both the reverse and constructive phases, I think of conceptual engineering in very much functional terms. One of the tasks isn't just to do a traditional conceptual analysis of the term, but to figure out its functions. And the task in doing evaluative and constructive engineering is to figure out what functions are served and how we can better serve them. So a lot rides on an assessment of linguistic functions, and I get to that work in chapter 7. And here I use work in systemic functional linguistics. A systemic functional linguistics is a tradition of work in linguistics, grew out of work in the Prague School, was influenced by Husserl's work in the logical investigations and by work of the anthropologist Malinowski, and was developed into its modern form by English linguists J.R. Firth and Michael Halliday. It's been very influential in anthropology and education, but much less known in philosophy. So systemic functional linguistics aims to analyze how the functions language serves in human life are reflected in ways that it's grammatically structured. So here's a sort of brief introduction to that work because it plays a big role. Early childhood language, as Michael Halliday identifies, serves many different functions. This is the language that a child learns first, usually between ages 1 and 3. And it can serve instrumental functions to serve material needs, as a child might yell, milk, to get her milk. Serves regulatory functions to control the behavior of others, if she yells, Mama, come. Serves interactional functions to greet or say goodbye, hi and bye-bye, right? Serves personal functions, that is to express the child's feelings of interest, pleasure, or disgust, like yuck, yay, and oops, as they drop something. It serves heuristic functions to investigate the environment, and for this, the child needs to start naming observable features of the world and learn how to track them. And it serves imaginative functions in play and pretense. Just notice how diverse these early childhood functions of language are, and how relatively late comes the informative or representational function. Again, this emerges closer to age 3, where we use language to try to communicate information about the world that we are tracking or describing, right? So that's the standard adult and philosophical model of language, but it's only a tiny fraction of what the child uses language to do. Now, all these different functions persist in adult language and more are added. But what happens in mature language is that we acquire the ability to use grammatical form. And that enables each clause that we utter to serve more than one function at a time. So grammar, as Michael Halliday puts it, allows for meanings which derive from different functions to be encoded together as integrated structures, so that every expression becomes, in principle, functionally complex, with a few exceptions like saying hi or something. So in a mature speaker's utterances, each clause typically serves three different types of functions. Ideational metafunctions, they call these metafunctions because they cover various particular functions. The ideational functions include encoding a propositional content in ways that enable communication and reasoning. These are what we've mostly focused on in philosophy. But there are also interpersonal metafunctions that enable speakers to show their relation to the listener or reader, to show their attitudes, judgments, and levels of certainty, and to regulate behavior. So in English, these are carried typically by mood and modality. So if rather than saying, John is at the door, I say, John might be at the door, I show my hesitancy while still talking about John and the door. If in using the mood system, I ask you a question, is John at the door? Then I place us in different social roles of questioner and answerer. If I utter a command in the imperative mood, right, then again, I place us in different roles too. If I say, open the door, I'm now placing myself in the social role of commander and you of the commanded. Then there's these textual metafunctions that organize a text as a piece of writing or speech, making evident the theme and relations among ideas. So our logical connectives serve this kind of role, showing the relations between clauses. Words like because, so, and if, and so on also serve these. So here's an exemplification. Suppose you're at the home of an acquaintance and they give you some tea. And maybe you're English, so you like milk in your tea. If you're a child, you might only have one option, to yell like, milk, in a commanding tone. If you're a grown-up, you might find that a bit rude. And you have many more options. You could speak in the imperative and say, give me milk. You could speak in the indicative and say, I want milk. You could speak in the interrogative and say, do you have some milk? You could use a modal indicative, modal interrogative and say, might I have some milk? Or you could say, some milk would be lovely, now in an indicative just describing the world, right? And these all have sort of different nuances of the level of politeness that's appropriate or inappropriate to your social interaction. In a longer conversation, you might ask, well, is it a black tea? And if they say yes, you might say, then I would like some milk for it. So notice in this simple clause, right, we have textual functions. The then shows the connection between your desire for milk and your question, and it's being black. The modal makes it much more polite rather than saying, give me some milk. And the ideational content still conveys the proposition that you want milk. Another idea we'll need from systemic functional linguistics is that of grammatical metaphors. This is a metaphor just in the sense, not of being merely metaphorical or fictional, but of a transfer, so from the Greek root, metaphor. Grammatical metaphors involve shifts from one grammatical category to another, and they can be made in all the languages that these linguists have studied, though how prevalent they are and how prevalent different kinds are varies from language to language. So we can move in grammatical categories, say from speaking of the apple, saying it is red, to speaking of the property of redness, introducing a noun. Or we could move from speaking of a knife, like she has a knife, to the verb and say she knifed someone. Now, grammatical metaphors have really important new functions in language. Here's the way it goes. Young children begin with what the linguists call congruent meanings. They might look at a scene like this and say, "Man, dance." Congruent discourse is acquired by responding to things you observe in the environment. They're useful because they help the child to learn about the environment and communicate about it. And they require causal connection to it. You observe the man dancing, you say, "Man, dance," and you're tracking. But from there, we can move on in a more sophisticated way to introduce grammatical metaphors, where a meaning that was originally construed by one kind of wording comes to be construed by another. So now you can say, "The man did a dance." Now, just this might sound like a sort of inconsequential rephrasing, but it actually has great importance. And we don't learn grammatical metaphors until quite a bit later. We start learning some at about age 3 or 4, but we don't fully master them till like age 8 to 12. So we can move from "the man danced" or "man dance" to "the man did a dance." And that enables us to do new things with language. One thing we can do is to qualify and quantify processes and events. So we can say now things like, about the dance, "The man did this well-known Romanian folk dance." Really hard to say with dance just as a verb. You can also count them. You can count the dances now and say, "The man did 3 dances in the play's second act." So grammatical metaphors add expressive power to the language. And this enables us to do more than just comment on the dances. It enables us to formulate generalized theories and explanations in ways that are essential to developing scientific theories. So think about your favorite laws of nature, right? Think about ideal gas laws, for example, that state the relationship between temperature, volume, and pressure for gases, right? This is dense with grammatical metaphors, right? You have to have grammatical metaphors, nouns like temperature, volume, and pressure, to be able to even state the law or to ask the question if there is a fixed relationship. Without that, with congruent language, the most you could say is "the gas got hot and expanded," right? But you can't get anything like a general law. They're not just useful in scientific theories. Grammatical metaphors are also essential to developing generalized systems of permissions and requirements that are needed for bureaucracies and for, you might say, developing the rule of law at all. So with just commands, you can be a Hobbesian sovereign and you can look at someone and say, "Bow to me" or "pay me taxes," right? But only by introducing a whole system of grammatical metaphors can you introduce a fixed system of permissions and requirements that applies to everyone, right? So you can only introduce laws of state, for example, that give the relationship between your incomes, your assets, your mortgage, and your marriage status, and how this affects your tax obligations, by introducing a huge array of grammatical metaphors. So grammatical metaphors have these essential uses in adding this kind of expressive power to language. And when we introduce them to language, we don't need to do any new observations of the world. We can introduce them by making licensed transfers, what I've elsewhere called redundant inferences. They sound redundant. That take us from, sorry, all these little rectangles should be arrows. From a claim like "the apple is red," we can infer that the apple has the property of redness. We've introduced a new noun term, but not on the basis of any new observation. From "there are 3 cups," we can say the number of cups is 3. From "snow is white," we can say it is a fact that snow is white. From "it might rain," we can say there is a possibility of rain, and so on. Okay, so now using that work in linguistics, we can sort of confirm the kinds of diagnoses of other metaphysical theories that I gave in part 1. Right? We can now see linguistic evidence of functional pluralism, right, applicable to many of the terms relevant to metaphysics, to moral and modal terms, which are part of the interpersonal system, to number terms and property terms that are grammatical metaphors. And we can see why we should reject many common general metaphysical criteria for accepting entities, like all entities must contribute explanatory power, or all truths must have truth makers. It's also going to help us develop a functional approach to conceptual engineering. I'll say more about that in a minute. First, in reverse engineering, before we start to evaluate whether we should keep or change any part of our language, we should begin by asking what functions it serves and what rules it follows. Now, how are we going to assess that? Well, again, we can use this work in linguistics. I think really there are two dimensions we can use in assessing the function of a term of interest in philosophy. One is sort of formal, and there we can use some of this work in linguistics to begin by asking what functions are served by having a modal system or having grammatical metaphors. We can also ask material questions about function. And here I follow Mathieu Kello's neat work, who develops a need-based genealogy by asking what practical problems various concepts might help us humans with. Why might we want to look at these? Knowledge, truth, possibility, number. These are all grammatical metaphors. So we can say at the start that they all probably help us in various kinds of generalizing functions for developing theories or bureaucracies. But what's the difference between, say, a concept of knowledge and a concept of possibility? So what I recommend in the book, and then in some papers that have followed this work, I have a paper on modality and a paper on truth, a paper on moral concepts, is a kind of stepwise approach that starts from the basic form and moves through the grammatical developments to see what functions are added at each stage. So for modality, you can start by asking about the functions of modal verbs like might or could. Notice how these are transformed into talk about what is possible, or a possibility, or a possible world, and ask what functions are added at each stage. There's various kinds of evidence we can use in determining functions, including developmental evidence. What can children do when they acquire a modal system that they couldn't do before? And also sort of counterfactual or state of nature questions like Mathieu Kello and Hugh Price ask. For example, what can a community do by having a concept of knowledge that they couldn't do otherwise? Okay, but let me show you, but rather than going into those details, how this helps with some old metaphysical problems. So existence questions, as I argued back in Ontology Made Easy, can often be answered by means of trivial inferences from uncontroversial premises. So we can start by saying the apple is red. We can make the inference that the apple has the property of redness, and then answer the question, are there properties? Yes, here's one, the property of redness possessed by the apple. The work in linguistics gives us new reason to think that those arguments are perfectly valid, given the rules for introducing property talk as grammatical metaphors. And it answers the question why we would want language that could be introduced by these redundant inferences. We have terms that follow these rules for good functional reasons. They enable us to engage in generalization that enables theory and explanation and bureaucracy in ways we couldn't do otherwise. We can also then re-examine a lot of the old metaphysical problems supposed to arise for abstract entities, right? So you've seen all these arguments against numbers or properties or raising doubt about them that, oh, maybe there aren't numbers because they'd be weird entities without a spatiotemporal location. We couldn't place them in the natural world. Or we couldn't come to know numbers because we're not in a causal relation to them. Or properties or meanings wouldn't add explanatory power to our theories, right? We can now see that all of these kinds of problems arise by a kind of false analogy or presupposition with observational congruent discourse that would think of terms for properties or numbers on analogy with terms for apples and tables and dogs, right, that are supposed to track features of the environment. But if this work in linguistics is right, these abstract nouns were never supposed to track features of the environment. Instead, they enable these forms of generalization, right? And so their failure to track things is no mark against them. So then we can start to see that it would be a terrible mistake to just deny that there are properties or numbers on grounds of these kinds of ontological qualms, or to try to do, as Hartree Field does, science without numbers. The terms are really very useful. And the entry rules entitle us to say there are such things in the only sense that has sense at all, sense given by their entry rules. The standard objections to them are misguided based on false analogies to congruent terms. This also sheds light on old problems with modality, right? So now we can see that modal language originates with interpersonal functions, not functions of describing some features, modal features of this world, or tracking other possible worlds. And we can give a neat, fine-grained account of why modal talk would develop through different grammatical forms in ways that raise these metaphysical puzzles. We can start with "it might rain" as serving interpersonal functions of showing my hesitancy in my claim about the weather. But we can nominalize from there and say there's a possibility of rain that enables us to say things like, the possibility of rain is greater today than tomorrow. We can even quantify and say the possibility of rain is 79% and compare that to other days, developing sophisticated meteorological theories. We can also say things like there is a possible world in which it rains. And that, again, adds expressive power to the language. That then enables us to re-examine some of the old puzzles about modality, right? The problems of modality are most often put as, what are the truth makers for modal claims? Well, we shouldn't be looking for truth makers. They're not trying to track the world in ways that demand truth makers. They're there for different functional reasons. Are there possible worlds? Well, sure, because we can make these trivial inferences from "it might rain" to "rain is possible" to "there's a possible world in which it rains." But we shouldn't be thinking of these as analogous to our world and just sort of spatiotemporally disconnected from it, as Lewis does. How are the modal features of the world grounded in natural features? How can the statue and the clay have different modal properties, but the same non-modal properties, all the same physical properties? Well, we shouldn't expect modal properties to be part of a layered view of reality where they're grounded in features of the clay itself, right? Instead, this modal talk is doing something functionally different. How can possible worlds be known if we're not in causal contact with them? Again, we shouldn't think of our knowledge of possible worlds on analogy with our knowledge of features of this spatiotemporal world. Okay, so the point, and this is stuff I develop in chapter 8 of Rethinking Metaphysics, is that this kind of reverse engineering work that can tell us about the functions of grammatical metaphors like property and number terms, or of modal terms like possibility and necessity, can give us the basis for easily answering existence questions, like I said back in Ontology Made Easy, but with new justification from the work in linguistics, and for disentangling ourselves from old metaphysical problems, seeing why we shouldn't worry about them. In these cases, right, the results are conservative. Modal talk's fine, number talk's fine, property talk's fine. Don't think you have to eliminate it to have a more parsimonious or less mysterious ontology. That's a mistake. But this kind of approach doesn't always mean that we won't be or shouldn't be making any changes to our linguistic or conceptual scheme. It won't always deliver such conservative results. And I take on this in chapter 9, where I discuss how to do evaluative and constructive conceptual engineering. So I think before you do any kind of engineering, you need to start by reverse engineering. Before you take a part out of a car or change it, you want to understand what it does for us and how it fits into the whole. And the same goes, I think, for conceptual engineering. So we want to first determine the functions and rules that the term, or kind of term, like modal terms or abstract nouns, follow. Then we can ask if those, once we know how what functions it serves, are those functions ones we should continue to serve? And is it serving them well, or has something gone wrong? Then we can engage in reconstruction, if appropriate, and ask whether the system of terms should be rejected, revised, or retained, either in order to better serve some good functions or to avoid serving some problem functions. And I think that we can do this kind of conceptual engineering work in a way that's systematic and not arbitrary by appealing to the functions that have been served and are to be served by the relevant sets of terms. So here's some examples. What should we do with our race and gender terms, or with a term like marriage, or with social terms like death, privacy, intelligence, or responsibility, as, say, our technology, medical, and otherwise advances? I won't have time to talk about all of these, but let me give you some examples. So our race terms, right? Race terms, as I understand it, were originally alleged to function like theoretical terms for natural science, supposed to enable generalizations about different groups of people and their capacities and their nature and so on. But as Anthony Appiah, I think, makes the case best for this that I know of, there just weren't any such stable generalizations to be found that could be confirmed about the differing features of people classified as belonging to different races. Oh, so if they were supposed to serve this kind of theoretic function in our generalized scientific theories, race terms seem to be failures. But wait, what else do grammatical metaphors do? Because these are, again, these kinds of abstract nouns are grammatical metaphors, the Caucasian race or whatever. But one thing we've learned from the linguistics is they also serve in bureaucracies. And what have these racial grammatical metaphors actually done? Well, they've lain beneath various formal and informal bureaucratic norms, systems of requirements and permissions, sometimes explicit, sometimes informal, applied to people classified as being of different races. And yet those kinds of different social roles, right, are completely unjustified by any sort of scientific claims about differences in their inherent characteristics. So now we have grounds for critique and showing that what they have done is actually something that we shouldn't want them to do. So if those are the functions they have served, these bureaucratic functions, we have reasons to rethink them. What should we do? Should we eliminate them entirely? Well, as Sally Haslinger points out, we might still need something like them if we want to diagnose racism. We might need something in that vicinity, as Quayshawn Spencer argues, for medical genetics, but we're definitely going to need some changes, and we have the grounds for seeing why and for starting to evaluate what changes to make. What about marriage, right? Well, here again, I think the right approach is to not begin with a metaphysical question. What is a marriage, or what is marriage really? As many opponents of marriage equality tended to do, and would say, no, marriage just is a union between one man and one woman. Instead, I think we should begin again with functional questions and make them explicit. What functions has the concept of marriage served? What functions does it serve in society? And which do we want it to continue to serve going forward? Right? If the function was to give over women as property, we might now want to reject that. If the function is to give a range of legal protections to certain kinds of close life-shaping relationships, maybe we want to bring that forward, but broaden it out if we can't see any reason to limit this to same-sex couples, to heterosexual couples. At any rate, once we've clearly laid out the functions, we can much more clearly determine if we need to make changes and lay them out for public justification. In the closing chapters of the book, I try to sort of lay out a program then for how we can do this kind of functionally guided conceptual engineering. And I bring other factors into consideration, like what I call site constraints, ways in which this term or concept is connected to others, human factors, that is how usable it will be for folks with our kinds of perceptual apparatus and culture and so on, how it's related to our knowledge and our social, environmental, and technical situation. This is all parallel to what we have to attend to in doing other kinds of engineering, like civil engineering in building a bridge, right? We have to attend to human factors, site constraints, the function of the bridge, if it's for a railroad or pedestrians or whatever, and other features of our technological situation, the budget constraints. But as with other forms of engineering, like building a bridge, once you take all those factors into account, it's not arbitrary which proposal to choose. Some choices are clearly better than others, given, say, the functions of the bridge. If it's going to fall down when you put a 2-ton truck on it and it's supposed to carry trucks, we can eliminate that proposal. Nonetheless, in each case, there might not be a uniquely best solution to the engineering problem. There may be 2 or more bridge proposals that are equally good, or 2 or more proposals for what to do with our marriage concepts that are equally good. Okay, so that's roughly what I have in mind by conceptual engineering when I talk about rethinking metaphysics as a kind of conceptual engineering. Rethinking metaphysics in this way, then, I come back to argue at the end of the book, helps avoid those problems that I began with that plague the traditional conception of metaphysics. We no longer have a rivalry with the sciences. Where we're doing descriptive work in reverse engineering, I think we need to work with psychology and linguistics, as I've tried to show, in determining how these parts of our linguistic and conceptual scheme function. But there's also this normative work of asking how and whether we should change our conceptual linguistic scheme, right? And this kind of ought question, ought we to change it? If so, how? It's just not addressed by the sciences at all. Remains for philosophy. The proliferation and skepticism that plagued traditional metaphysics, I think it shows up really differently if you think about metaphysics as conceptual engineering. As I just mentioned, we don't get a complete proliferation of views. We can narrow down which views are suitable according to which will do well at fulfilling the functions that we think ought to be pursued. Nonetheless, when we have more than one that remains, this is not an embarrassment any longer because we don't know which is the true view. Instead, what we have maybe is a range of alternative good solutions to engineering problems that we can choose from among. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing. We also lose the epistemological mystery of traditional metaphysics in trying to say how we can discover the fundamental facts about reality. At each of these stages, there's nothing more than empirical and conceptual work involved, where the conceptual work includes both descriptive and normative work. But there aren't deep and hidden metaphysical facts we're trying to uncover. So it can have a kind of epistemological clarity. I also argue there's questions about whether this view of conceptual engineering is close enough to traditional metaphysics that we should still call it metaphysics. I think we should, but this is arguable. Why I think we should is because I think it does preserve the importance and value of a lot of work in the history of metaphysics, which goes back way before 1950, which is when many of these conceptions sort of originated, then or later. A lot of historical projects in metaphysics can really be seen, even I think often best seen, as engaged in descriptive and normative conceptual engineering, including work by Kant, Hume's work on causation, liberty and necessity, Locke's work on persons, Berkeley's work on matter, a lot of the discussions in philosophy of art, and so on. So I go through some of those, trying to suggest we can understand them in these terms, and we're preserving continuity with that kind of historical work in metaphysics. Maybe more importantly, on this view, metaphysics doesn't risk being displaced by the sciences, and it remains centrally relevant to human life because it matters what concepts we use for person, freedom, right, privacy, knowledge, art, mind, justice, health, responsibility, and many more. So figuring out how these concepts work, what functions they serve, what functions they should serve, and what we should do with them is really important. And its work is never finished. So on this view, the project of metaphysics is not a matter of trying to write the book of the world, as Ted Sider puts it, or find some book of eternal truths about what the world is like. Instead, it's an ongoing project that involves constantly rethinking what terms and concepts we should use and how we should use them as our society changes, as our knowledge about the world changes, as our technology changes, and as our environment changes. And so this is what I call the perennial philosophical project that remains if we rethink of metaphysics in these terms. So metaphysics rethought in this way is not a deep inquiry into the nature of reality that looks like a second-rate rival to the natural sciences. Instead, it's an ongoing project of thinking through how we do and how we should think and talk. It's never going to be completed, and it's always going to be centrally important because how we think and talk really matters to how we live. And that's it.
Excellent. So thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Thomasson.
Okay.
Now we have some time for questions and discussion. We already have some questions on the
Oh,
YouTube chat,
great.
but I would like to break the ice and raise the first question. And I'm going to start with a bold statement, actually, because I think that Rethinking Metaphysics is the best book in the trilogy because it encompasses your work from Ontology Made Easy and Norms and Necessity. For example, you're still dealing with a neo-Carnapian perspective in which we have to assume a specific linguistic framework and then ask questions that are internal to it, and then we're going to easily answer them either empirically or conceptually. And I
Right.
think that you took a lot from Norms and Necessity when it comes to your discussion on modality.
Mhm.
But in Rethinking Metaphysics, you assume a different methodology in one sense, because now you're dealing with conceptual engineering. And on the other hand, you're also using systemic functional linguistics. And I think it functions, it works very well. If I could make a summary of your book, I
Yeah.
would say that part one stands on its own, even if your reader doesn't agree with your criticisms on the metaphysics that is being made since the 20th century, because the reconstruction you made of all those perspectives, such as the explanatory view, the structural view, the truth maker, fundamentality, grounding views, was so honest and so elegant that even if someone is interested in those positions and agree with them, they're going to read something that is very interesting and fruitful for further discussions. And of course, I agree with a criticism, and it raises a lot of worry about what we should do in contemporary metaphysics, because I do agree that there is a rivalry with the sciences, especially when it comes to the Quinean perspective, or that there is a proliferation of views that leads to skepticism and epistemological mysteries. And I think I have a lot of sympathy for the answers you give in the second part of the book when it comes to conceptual engineering. I was particularly interested in reverse engineering,
Mhm.
the descriptive part of the work. I think I'm also going to read Kelos, I think is the author.
Oh, yeah,
Kelos,
Matsukello. Yeah, his work's fantastic. I highly recommend it to anybody. Yeah.
yeah, the genealogical part of the project. And of course, we have to reassess our language and concepts in order to do constructive engineering, which is the normative part of the work. But my question, putting it very straightforwardly, why would be preferable for us to engineer language rather than concepts? Because I think you hold this position on chapter 8, if I'm not mistaken. But what would be the advantages of engineering language in this case?
Yeah, good question. And just to be really clear, I do it via language here, but it's not that I'm against doing it via concepts. So, in fact, I think they can be kind of complementary approaches. Um, here are the advantages that I found to working with language here. One is I didn't really want to get into questions about what concepts are. That would be a book or several books in itself. There's so many controversies about it. Um, so that's just a sort of purely pragmatic in the everyday sense reason. But the other thing is, I think that language, I found this work in linguistics. And the interesting thing, all metaphysical questions have to be asked using language and answered using language. That's just inevitable, right? And the interesting thing about language is it's really obviously interpersonal in a way that thought isn't, right? You can argue about thought, right? But at least the traditional conception, people tend to think of it as internal and private and so on. Whereas language, in some ways, obviously, we use it in interacting with each other, in greeting and insulting and all of that. Language also really obviously involves these different grammatical forms. Is anything like that similar in the language of thought? Yeah, I don't know. That would take a lot of investigation, right? But language obviously has these different grammatical forms. And so both the interpersonal functions of language, say of the modal system, right, and the different grammatical forms that are involved in introducing grammatical metaphors for properties and numbers and the like, right, are really central to where these metaphysical problems come from. And I think we can put our finger on them much better if we can look at the linguistic level and identify, say, the interpersonal functions that make it worthwhile to introduce modal language, right? And look at the generalizing functions that make it worthwhile to enable us to engage in these kinds of grammatical transfers. So those two features, I think, are really most easily and obviously identified in language. Now, the reason that a lot of people give, and then I found this new work in systemic functional linguistics that was just so fantastic too. I thought really brings something new to the discussion that other folks hadn't identified. The reason people hesitate sometimes to talk about language instead of concepts is because they'll often say, well, yeah, but we don't care about the English term person or whatever, right? You can do it equally well in Brazilian Portuguese or German or Igbo or whatever, right? Which is totally fair, right? But I think we can easily get to these kinds of conceptual issues by just sort of generalizing from a term or any of its sort of apt translations across languages and make it clear that it's not like the phonetics or the spelling we care about. But we also want to be careful to attend to sometimes there are subtle differences in the conceptual scheme that's rendered in, say, I think I've been told, you all can help me out with this, that our standard English race terms in the US just don't translate clearly into the ones that would be used in Brazilian Portuguese. And you have to be attentive to that too, and not just speak of the concept of Caucasian or something like that as if there weren't these problems. So I think it can also be useful to remind us to attend to the peculiarities of an individual language. But anyway, that's a long-winded answer.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. I have a follow-up, actually, which would be, is systemic functional linguistics a necessary condition for this kind of conceptual or linguistic engineering to work? Or can I still be a Thomassonian in this sense if I adopt, for example, speech act theory? What's really indispensable for systemic functional linguistics in this case?
Okay, so what I think is indispensable is finding some preferably empirically well-grounded way to answer questions about what the functions are of different areas of language, right? So speech act theory is great. You can keep it. I'm going to keep it too. I don't mean it's all yours. I mean, but I think it just asks a different set of questions. So speech act theory tends to focus on questions like, what did Smith do? What was he doing when he said, shut the door? Was he insulting or commanding or whatever, right? Whereas the systemic functional linguistics addresses questions like, what does modal vocabulary enable a language to do that it couldn't do otherwise? So, I think the results should ideally be compatible. It'd be nice to see where they meet. What I think we need to do this kind of engineering well is a way of answering these kinds of functional questions about language. I think there's actually many ways to do it. I think I haven't seen a better grounded answer to questions about what the modal or the grammatical metaphors do than systemic functional linguistics. if somebody comes up with reasons for altering it that are empirically grounded, obviously let's go with it. But I think there's also other ways you can address these functional questions, and that's like Kello's method, and you see this in Price and in some other sort of ancient parts of the well, not ancient parts of the neo-pragmatist tradition that will ask these kinds of counterfactual questions. You can also just try more directly to address these kinds of state of nature counterfactual questions. What couldn't we do, or couldn't we do so well if we didn't have a knowledge concept, say, or a concept of person or whatever. And I think those are perfectly well worth, they fall under some criticism, but I think they're worth taking seriously also. And that's a different route to getting answers to some of these functional questions. So I wouldn't be like exclusive, it's got to be in the book of a Halliday student or forget it, right? But I think answering these questions is really important. And I think they've provided some very compelling and helpful answers that they tested out through education theory mostly. Like their whole goal was to figure out what the kids can't do who haven't acquired a modal system or who have a language delay. So in that way, it gets kind of empirically tested.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your answer. Now we're going to the questions that are on the chat. Here's one from Professor Marco Silva, so I'm going to read it out loud. And he says, thank you for your talk, Amie. Question: how your project of Rethinking Metaphysics could deal with mathematical objects, mathematical necessity, and second-order reasoning in set theory, for instance?
Okay, that's a hard one. That's a lot. Let me take it in order. Thank you for the question. So mathematical objects, I'll start there. At least some, like numbers, for example, right? Then we can see how number terms get introduced as grammatical metaphors from sort of determiner uses where you'd say there are 3 cups on the table, to a noun to say the number of cups on the table is 3. We can see why grammatical metaphors in general are useful. They enable certain kinds of generalizing functions that will enable us to better, in this case, I think the main answer is engage in theorizing, scientific theorizing. So you can see things like, obviously there's things you can't say without noun terms for numbers, like 3 is an odd number, for example, or claims about the rate of expansion of gases in this context or whatever. This is a point that Steve Yablo makes really nicely in his paper, The Myth of the Seven, that there are sort of laws in physics that can't even be stated in finite form without noun terms that refer to numbers. So the number terms, grammatical metaphors, serve functions of enabling these kinds of generalization in theory that we couldn't have otherwise. That's also part of why they can't easily be unpacked and just put back down into terms of, say, applied mathematics. Mathematical necessity. So I don't say a lot about that. I say a little bit about it in norms and necessity. So I think of claims about necessity in general as ways of making explicit various kinds of norms. So metaphysical necessity, I think of as semantic norms, making explicit semantic norms, like don't call it a statue if it's undergone a squashing, for example. For logical and mathematical, I think these are more norms for reasoning. In the mathematical case, presumably it focuses on quantitative reasoning, right? So I think of these claims as fundamentally normative. And so mathematical necessity claims and would give us norms for quantitative reasoning using these sort of grammatical metaphors. I hope that's helpful. I'm not sure what to say about second order reasoning and set theory, so I think I'll spare you my attempt to address that, and I have to leave it for others more expert.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now we have a question from G. Neves. It's a 3-part question, so let's start from here. Should the seemingly strictly ideational function of children's use of language be understood as evidence that the metaphysicist's representationalism is correct for some part of language?
Okay, nice. Oh, you get it. Okay, let's say more.
Okay, so, or is this infantile monofunctional use of language merely defective, and the fact that adult speaks always plurifunctional be understood as reason to abandon its in its entirety the representationalist conception of how world change relations work.
Okay, can you scroll up for me again so I can see from the top?
Yes.
Okay.
Here we go.
Okay. So let me start from there. So first, I think, according to the folks in systemic functional linguistics, children's use of language is not strictly ideational. In fact, the other functions like commanding their elders to bring them milk, for example, or saying yuck and expressing their feelings towards the food, or saying hi and bye-bye, actually tend to come earlier than sort of what you might think of as representational uses used to try to communicate information to people that are thought not to know it. The sort of closely related claim that is right is that this children, when they're learning language, some of what they learn is interactional, hi and bye-bye and so on. But the sort of worldly terms they learn first are congruent, right? And those are terms that are acquired through observation and that serve the function of enabling them to track worldly features. So that's as close as you get to a kind of representational view of knowledge, or view of language, I should say. So something like that kind of representationalism is more or less correct for congruent, observationally acquired language. And what I think happens is that's our sort of standard paradigm, right? If you look at all your standard philosophy texts, they'll all consider claims like snow is white, grass is green, right? This is standard observationally acquired congruent language. So I think that something like the metaphysical view of language and the sort of Kripkean view of reference, for that matter, are pretty close, at least, with some maybe edits needed for that branch of language. And what goes wrong is that we artificially generalize it and apply it to any language whatsoever, including our terms for possibilities and our terms for moral obligations and so on. Italo, do you mind just scrolling down, make sure I didn't miss the later parts of the question? Okay, and again. Yeah. So I think then the sort of way to end this answer is, by the time we get to metaphysical questions, most of these arise for terms that are acquired much later, right? Modal language is quite a bit later than regular congruent observational terms. Modal language comes in about age 3-ish, I think, depending on the form. Grammatical metaphors arise much later. So by the time you get to metaphysical problems, you have to really be concerned with language that is, as the questioner puts it, sort of plurifunctional. And then you've really got to bring that in and abandon the simplistic analogy to congruent observational discourse that does form at least a large chunk of what the child learns first.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. Now we have a question from Henrique Moraes. And here it goes. The question is, even if some terms don't ordinarily have the functions needed for traditional metaphysics, can't we still use them in a technical sense, ontologies, to ask metaphysical questions? Or do you think these questions can't even really be raised at all? Thanks.
Yeah, okay, good question. That's one that the sort of serious metaphysicians often raise to me. So I have a lot of suspicion of the idea that you can just ask them in a metaphysical sense. So for me, it's something like this. So this actually came up with my work on modality first, right? So I say that our modal terms serve the function of conveying semantic rules, not of trying to describe modal facts and properties. And Michaela McSweeney says, well, why couldn't we just, in the metaphysics room, use them to try to describe modal facts and properties, right, in a sort of tracking sense in this way? To me, that is rather like saying, okay, I know that hello is used as a greeting, but now in this room, I'm going to use it as a term to sort of track a feature of reality and saying no more about it. I mean, it's okay if you then point at a dog and the dog's name's going to be hello, but now it's really just a homonym with our original greeting term, right? So I think that in most cases, we don't have a clear conception of what it would be to use them in this sort of metaphysical sense, what we need is some new introduction rules. The introduction rules we have for these things don't require a connection to some feature of the environment or something like that. And so I think very often these kinds of metaphysical debates, the attempt to introduce the term in a metaphysical sense just is way underspecified, and we just don't even know what we're talking about anymore. And then it's no wonder that we can't answer these questions. And I think we certainly risk falling into the kind of nonsense that would be like, yeah, I mean hi, but as a sort of tracking referring term or something like that, and we'd have no idea what you're talking about. So I'm kind of I urge caution about that kind of move anyway.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And now we have a long question by Rafael Carvalho. So these are 4 different parts, right? So part 1 says the following. Professor Thomasson, I've been reflecting on the connections between mathematical fictionalism and Kendall Walton's theory of make-believe, especially the role of props in imaginative practices. Then he says, can we interpret numbers not merely as abstract objects or tools of quantification, but rather as functional placeholders in representational games akin to Waltonian props, where they help structure and articulate qualitative features of reality in ways that resemble make-believe practices, for example, treating a tree stump as a bear in children's play. In this light, are numbers genuinely necessary, or can their role be fully captured through qualitative descriptions that track real-world relations without ontological inflation?
Okay, good. So your question, thank you very much for that, brings to mind for me Stephen Yalblow's work, which I've spent a lot of time with. So I hope that's some of what you have in mind. I have 2 lines of response. I've learned a lot from it, and I actually have a lot of sympathy with these kinds of fictionalist treatments. I feel like fictionalists are often those who start to notice that there are other functions of language than just to track and describe features of the world. So that much we have in common. There's 2 places where I have reservation and why I wouldn't go fictionalist myself or call myself a fictionalist about most anything, really, including numbers, also fictional characters, which is where I started, which is a little funny, but we can talk about that. So 2 reservations. One is, I think again, I'm not a philosopher of math, but as I understand it, and also from reading Yalblow's work, the sort of fictionalist treatment of numbers as kinds of props in games of make-believe that enable us to clearly say things about the real world, that works real nice for applied mathematics. It's not so easy or so great for pure mathematics, right? Where we have to discuss not just, the number of buffalo on the plain and how they relate to the number of giraffes or how they've decreased over the last decade or whatever, but rather where we want to discuss, very abstract features of relationships between groups of numbers, for example. So there's problems with that kind of pure fictionalist view for pure mathematics, as I understand it. That's not my case. I think even Yalbo mentions this. In a way, it shouldn't be surprising, because when we introduce these grammatical metaphors, we add expressive power to the language in ways that is often impossible to unpack and pack back down to the more simpler forms. That's why they're useful. The other sort of reservation I have about fictionalism here is that, fictionalism makes sense, I think, where we have a difference between the literal meaning of a term and its meaning in the fiction or its criteria of use. So in the standard Walton stumps bears game, right? If we're playing that stumps count as bears, and I say that there are 4 bears in the backyard, right? That's true in the game. Really, there's only 4 stumps, right? That's fine. But we can distinguish what it is to be true in the game from what it is to be true really, really. For there to be 4 bears in the yard in the game requires just bottoms of old trees, right? Stumps. For there to be bears really, really requires certain biological beings that are large and furry and so on, right? So we can make this sort of contrast. And that's why it's only fictional. In the case of numbers, we can't make this contrast between what it takes, according to the story, for there to be numbers, story of mathematics, and what it would really, really take, right? So there is no use of number terms outside of mathematics to give them some sense, such that we can say those criteria aren't met, right, in the real world. And I think the search for these criteria also sort of involves people in artificial metaphysical inflation. There would have to be some special object, or whatever Platonists say would have to be true, but I think it's not clear what content can be given to those, because I think the rules of use for number terms are really given in mathematics, and there the relevant conditions are met. So this is really where I come apart from Yablo. I have a paper from 2013 or 2014 called Fictionalism versus Deflationism, trying to sort of make this point against him. And it really came to my mind because I spent a lot of time working on Walton. Also, interestingly, like, even for the fictional character case, as I mentioned, right, I think we also can't be pure fictionalists about fictional characters. There's a difference between what it would take to be Sherlock Holmes, the man, according to the story, and in real life, that's fine. But if we want to talk about fictional characters and how many stories they appear in and their place in literary history, for that, we can't just talk about what's true according to the story. We also need this sort of nominalized use of a term like fictional character, and that can't be unpacked. So there is a kind of parallel to like the pure mathematics case there. I hope that made sense.
Excellent. And that discussion is also on chapter 5 from Ontology Made Easy, which
That's
is
right.
that
The revised
paper.
version there. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, excellent. So now there is a question from Gabriel Espanhol. It's a two-part question, and he asks, it seems that on the reverse engineering, when we ask if we should still serve a function, couldn't it be open to different answers? And then he asks, different groups of society may have different views on what, for example, marriages should do and accomplish. What could be done to reduce this relativization?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's super legitimate. So I think what's going to happen when we do this kind of reverse engineering and constructive engineering phase. I mean, the reverse engineering is a little more of a factual matter, right? So what functions have been served by this, what couldn't have happened without the concept of marriage, and so on. But the looking forward, what functions should the concept of marriage serve going forward? And there may be multiple, of course, in the reverse case that we'll identify. For that, it is going to be open to many different opinions and views. And I really think the best we can do is to at least lay them on the table and try to come up with more broadly publicly acceptable arguments on either side. If we're doing something like deciding what the criteria for marriage should be in my community or my legal system or whatever, this is something that ideally we should reach agreement on together. And we have to at least put them on the table and make them honest. So rather than say, the metaphysical view, well, I just think marriage is one man and a relation between one man and one woman, right? And putting it in metaphysical terms, if what that is serving is to propagate a certain kind of traditional conception of the family with maybe traditional gender roles and so on too, you got to at least put that on the table, and that will be publicly acceptable to some and not to others. But at least you don't look like you are discovering some covert fact about the essence of marriage that is just not open to question, and that has to be weighed against people who say, yeah, but there are people who thrive better, whose lives find more fulfillment in a same-sex relationship, and what are the good justifications for denying them the legal protections? Make a public case for it. So I think there will have to be a lot of public hashing out. I think it can be done at least more honestly with this methodology, but it's not going to give us a straight up, okay, here's how we go answer every time.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Thomasson. We are running out of time, so the following question is going to be the last, probably, and it's from Jersey. It's a three-part question, so let's start from here. So Jersey says, the same way that we should be functional pluralists about language, I understand we should also be pluralists about the mechanisms through which grammatical metaphors come about. So consider the sub-project of describing the mechanism by which a particular grammatical metaphor came about. Would that fit in with the descriptive part of conceptual engineering? Sometimes this seems to be in service of the normative side, example, rejecting some racial terms, precisely because of the mechanisms that originated them. So here's the question.
Okay. Can you scroll through it again for me so make sure I get it all in my head? Okay.
Then part 2.
Okay, so the very short answer to the end. Oh, sorry, that's not the end. Okay, let me try. You're up one. There's something I want to say. Yeah, okay. So I think a first line of response, and I hope I get your question in full, Jersey, is there are different mechanisms by which grammatical metaphors come about. And by mechanisms, I'm understanding, I hope this is close to what you have in mind, Jersey, how we get this sort of grammatical transference, right? So a grammatical metaphor always involves a shift in grammatical category. But there are differences in what it originates from, which grammatical category and how it transfers. So here's one really important set of differences. There's a difference between grammatical metaphors that are introduced from, say, ideational language, especially congruent observational language originally, versus from interpersonal language. So the first would be like, I see a red apple. I can say the apple is red. I can engage in the grammatical metaphor and say, so the apple has the property of redness, for example. Or I can see a knife and I can just say, she knifed someone, right? The second will involve the metaphors of, as they call them, mood and modality. So that would involve moving from saying, it might rain to there's a possibility of rain, where might starts out as obviously as a modal term, as part of the interpersonal system. So there are some really important differences there, and those also make a difference sometimes to how we're going to resolve the metaphysical problems. I think I talk about this a little bit in maybe chapter 8. I think it is a matter for descriptive linguistics, how they come about, how the derivation works in each case. Can you just scroll again? I think I'm missing the normative part. Yeah, that's the so
I think it's part number 3.
Yeah, that's the part I think I haven't addressed. So I think in that case, it's not so much the difference in mechanism that makes a difference to whether we should reject the terms, right? If we think of ourselves as moving from, Smith is white to Smith has the property of being white, Smith is of the white race is a race that originated, whatever. The grammatical mechanism is okay. The trouble is, why do we want a general term like this, right? The functions that it was to serve and has served. The functions that it was ostensibly to serve, let's say, were to serve for underlying scientific generalizations. They didn't really work. Just like, phlogiston didn't really work, right? Just didn't pan out. But the functions that have actually can probably explain why it persisted in the vocabularies of so many nations in the post-colonial world were these bureaucratic ones. So now if we want to reject those functions, we should no longer use the terms, or at least not use them in the same way and for the same purposes. So in all cases, right, I think you can say these kinds of grammatical metaphors, they can serve roles in scientific theory and bureaucracy. They're kind of built-in criteria for whether we should use them, whether they've worked in scientific theorizing, if they enable the right kinds of generalizations, if they enable us to make better theories, they're going to make more successful predictions and so on. In the bureaucratic case, right, then it's open to these kinds of moral questions. Why should we single out this group? I mean, you could introduce a grammatical metaphor for People with a shorter second toe or something like that, right? We could totally do that. Why would we want to? What would it be used for, right? Are these the kinds of differences that we should build our different bureaucratic systems on the basis of? And so if we're dealing with grammatical metaphors that serve these kinds of bureaucratic, moral, legal functions, then I think we can ask questions about like why we can single out various kinds of superficial differences, right? Why would we want to? Is that a good kind of distinction to make? Is it capable of serving as a justification for differences in your legal standing, tax standing, educational standing, whatever it may be? So I think that's where the kinds of and another sort of motivation for rejecting some would be simple. You could also sort of engage in critique as deception. These purport to be natural scientific terms. They can't really do that. So we should at least resolve the deception and figure out if they have a good positive reason for being. So there's reasons for rejecting terms as bureaucratic kinds of grammatical metaphors that have to do with their fulfilling functions that we think are no longer justified, or with their being deceptive in some way, that are kind of different from the reasons for rejecting the scientific ones. In no case, I think, is it that there's a problem with the grammar exactly, but why adopt the grammatical transformation in this case instead of many others?
Yeah, that's great. And it seems like the same applies to mereological sums, for example.
That's well said.
The sum of my nose and Eiffel Tower exist? Yeah, but why should we bother about that, right? Doesn't matter.
Exactly. That's exactly how I would address that kind of question. Like, I can see the intuitions on both sides, because those who say there are, it's like, yeah, obviously, once you've defined the term, those who say there aren't, it's like, why? Why would we care? Why would we want to introduce such terminology? Isn't this just frivolous? Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Professor Thomasson, one last question. What's next? What's your next project going to be? Are you going to tour with Rethinking Metaphysics? So what's next?
I go wherever I'm invited, mostly, time permitting. So I do have a couple things coming up on Rethinking Metaphysics. One's in Spain. There's a sort of one-day conference on it coming up in October, I believe, in Madrid. But what I've mostly been working on after that is sort of follow-up projects that often involve applying this methodology to other fraught and controversial philosophical terms. So as I mentioned briefly, I've got a paper, one's already out, on modality, trying to give this kind of stepwise analysis of the functions of different forms of modal discourse. I've got one I've been working on for a while now on moral discourse, on talk about moral facts, moral obligations, all that sort of stuff, trying to show the origins of moral discourse and what functions it serves in these different forms and how that makes us think differently about old metaethical problems. I've got one on truth that I've been working on. I've got one on law, which is fantastic, actually. I got invited to write a piece on law, and I read H.L.A. Hart's The Concept of Law. And it's one of the best pragmatic stories I've seen about like why legal discourse would develop in these ways. So I have one building on that. I want to do it on mind if I can figure out what to say. That's sort of on my to-do list. So I think the next phase is trying to make good on some of this material to apply it to other big philosophical problems. And I might eventually gather maybe 4 or 5 papers like this into a book, kind of on analogy with Ryle's dilemmas, that sort of just looks at a bunch of different problems and applying the same methodology, and put them together in a book. I think my tentative title is Unravelings, where I try to address the different problems. I have an initial chapter on systemic functional linguistics, giving the background needed, and then applying it to these kind of different problems.
That's great. I'm looking forward to reading those papers. And now some final remarks. Gilson said the most Brazilian thing ever. Please come to Brazil.
Awesome.
She did 2 years ago, but we should invite you again because it was great.
I would love to come back. That was a fantastic visit. I was there for Principia about 2 years ago now, I guess, almost to the day, and it was fantastic. So I would love to come back sometime. So I hope I get the opportunity. Thanks so much for your interest.
Awesome. So Gabriel is also thanking. And that's it. So Professor Thomasson, thank you very much for your excellent conference and for answering our questions. Thank you at home for being our audience and for the questions that were raised. And this is the end of this session. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much to everyone for the great questions. And thank you, Italo, for chairing this and for your great questions and discussions. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.